This video is going to be addressing the concept of punctuated equilibrium, that is, what it is, how it works, and how creationists butcher it to suit their own agenda. Now, punctuated equilibrium is the idea that life on Earth experiences little evolutionary change for most of their history, and then when evolution does occur due to rapid environmental changes and things like that, we see rapid speciation. Punctuated equilibrium is in contrast with a concept known as phyletic gradualism, which states that evolution generally occurs uniformly and smoothly throughout life's history. So it's important to note before we begin that while these ideas do oppose one another, they're not mutually exclusive. The research now into this aspect of speciation merely concerns what role each mechanism plays and to what extent. So, organisms change based on their environment. When the environment changes, new niches are opened up, allowing for adaptation and segregation and things like that. Another thing which can happen with a rapidly changing environment is that mass extinction events can occur, kicking evolution into overdrive and forcing species to either change or die. Remember that organisms do not know to change. The variation responsible for change is already there by the time the event occurs, and the event merely selects the new trait at an extremely high rate. A poor and oversimplified example would be a massive volcano eruption or an asteroid impact, which would lower the Earth's temperature by a large amount. Let's say, for example, that there is an existing bear population with lots of genetic variation. If you've seen a lot of my earlier videos, you'll remember how important genetic variation and genetic variability is in terms of evolution. So, in this population, most bears have short hair due to the warm climate, but 1% of the population has longer hair. And another 1% of the population has hair which has the equivalent of split ends that are barely noticeable but do help to retain heat better than the other varieties. Now, in the warm environment, these traits are selected against, but they're very hard to eliminate from the population as a whole, which is why they retain and why they remain in the population at the very low 1% rate. So everything in our bear population goes fine until this catastrophic event occurs, which results in a much cooler climate. 95% of the bear population dies within a few days of the cold, but the 2% of the population with the genes for long hair and split ends are able to survive. Suddenly, the percentage of the population with these characteristics jumps from 1% per trait to nearly 50%. Now, eventually, bears with longer and longer hair and split ends will be produced, which enable them to thrive in the cold climate, which is, again, very important to evolution as a whole. This is roughly how evolution works. Now, note that these bears didn't suddenly mutate once the cold came. The variation was already there, and natural selection acted on the existing material to change the genetic frequency. Now, this enables the bears to adapt, and in a relatively small number of generations, they'll become very different from their ancestors. Again, this is a very watered-down, oversimplified, and imperfect example, but it conveys the basics of population genetics and the type of things that can cause an organism to change rapidly in a short amount of time. So with this example in mind, that's sort of how punctuated equilibrium works. The basis is merely that life changes based on its environment. If the history of the Earth has not been a smooth, gradual one, why would we expect the history of life to be? In reality, both phyletic gradualism and punctuated equilibrium occur, albeit life is always evolving. It does evolve rather slowly, except during periods of rapid environmental changes. And such an adaptive explosion can be seen supporting punctuated equilibrium in bryozoans, which appeared about 140 million years ago, had little to no change at all for about 40 million years, and then exploded into a variety of new species. And indeed, the observations made from the fossil record largely support the predictions made by punctuated equilibrium. So now that we've discussed what punctuated equilibrium is, let's take a look at how creationists butcher this concept to fit their own agenda. I first turned to our friends over at the Discovery Institute, hoping that they had something on the subject that I could rip apart. However, they didn't really have anything on it. So next I turned to Reasons to Believe, which, if you recall, I did a few radio calls a couple months back and posted them on the air where I discussed evolution with some of their hosts. Now, they could never answer any of my questions, and it was kind of embarrassing, and we were always waiting on their expert to appear. Well, this is their expert, Dr. Faz Rana, and he did he's actually written quite a bit about evolution on his site and stuff, and he happened to do a piece on punctuated equilibrium, which I'll talk about now. Dr. Rana begins by saying proponents of punctuated equilibrium posit that evolution only occurs when a small subpopulation of a species becomes isolated from the general population. Now, this is clearly not true, as I demonstrated earlier that punctuated equilibrium and phyletic gradualism both occur. Punctuated equilibrium is not the only means by which speciation occurs. This is basic biology, and if Dr. Rana is going to write on it, he really shouldn't confuse the two. Secondly, he says that punctuated equilibrium seems to explain the fossil record. If a new species emerges rapidly from a small peripheral population, it would seem as if the new species appeared suddenly in the fossil record, and that few, if any, transitional fossils would be expected. Now, Ron is somewhat correct here in that if punctuated equilibrium is true, we wouldn't expect to find many transitional forms, because that transition happens in such a small amount of time as the species rapidly radiate out. But unfortunately, we have thousands of transitional fossils that Dr. Rana chooses to ignore because they completely contradict his creationist agenda. For examples of transitional fossils, you can see my transitional fossils playlist, in which I have plenty of them listed. Dr. Fuzz Rana then goes on to attack the mechanism of punctuated equilibrium, stating that this scientific research completely disproves punctuated equilibrium and evolution as a whole. Now, the first paper that he cites deals with the strength of mutations and their effects on an extinction event. The paper found that large numbers of weak mutations were more detrimental to a species surviving simply because natural selection can't act on them as strongly. CDK007 did a nice video explaining this phenomenon, which I'll link to in the video description. So what Rana somewhat concludes from this paper is that because weak mutations wreak havoc over time on small populations, punctuated equilibrium's mechanisms lead to extinction, not evolution. Well, this is completely different from what the paper concluded, and it's akin to saying that because fatal heart attacks are linked to high levels of cholesterol, our human ancestors couldn't have eaten any fat because it would have instantly killed them. That's, of course, just pathetic. Now, the second paper he cites is kind of funny, actually, and half sad. He writes that investigators from Washington University in St. Louis produced fieldwork confirming the work done by the scientists from the University of Oregon. Studying collared lizards in the Missouri Ozarks, the Washington University scientists showed habitat fragmentation doesn't drive speciation, rather it leads to extinction. Unfortunately, this paper is about conservation biology. It's discussing the effects of human activity on extinction, and one of those effects is that habitat fragmentation in the form of forest fires, which we create, in which one large stable population is split into smaller ones. Now, these smaller populations are less stable and more likely to go extinct, leading to a net loss of individuals of a species, which is something conservation biology wants to preserve. What Fuzz has idiotically done is take this paper on the dangers of forest fires and said, aha, man-made habitat fragmentation is killing lizards here, so the mechanisms supposedly responsible for speciation actually lead to extinction. No, Fuzz, that's just wrong. Habitat fragmentation does lead to speciation, but when you're trying to prevent a population from going extinct, it's a good idea not to set their homes on fire. The paper isn't supporting you in the least. Now, I'd also like to point out there that there are hundreds of papers demonstrating that habitat fragmentation speeds up speciation, but Fuzz completely ignores all of these and zeroes in on the ones that he can twist in order to distort and demonstrate his point of view. Now, whether he does this through malice or sheer stupidity, I can't really say. So, something else that's interesting is that just for amusement's sake, I emailed the author of that paper to let him know what the creatards were up to, and he responded, "What can I say but oi? That the creationists certainly will not like the papers we're preparing now about the collared lizards, Alan." Well, that author clearly rejects evolution. In this piece, Ron X goes on to say that these two studies create a serious problem for the evolutionary paradigm. As I discussed last week, the strict Darwinian evolution lacks the necessary corroboration from the fossil record and cannot be declared a fact. First off, no, those papers didn't pose any problem for evolution, and your attempt to mislead people failed miserably. Secondly, evolution lacks corroboration from the fossil record? That's just an imbecilic assertion, and it's like saying that the cell theory lacks corroboration from microscopy. Not only is it false, but the fossil record provides some of the strongest evidence for evolution in the form of transitional fossils, as well as the spatial and temporal deposition of those fossils. Bringing up the fossil record as evidence against evolution just demonstrates how purely ignorant this creationist is about both evolution and the fossil record. Next, Rana states, punctuated equilibrium explains the fossil record, yet fails due to the absence of a legitimate mechanism and must be rejected as an explanation for life's history. Well, I just demonstrated that you, Dr. Rana, butchered these papers and did nothing to challenge the validity of these mechanisms whatsoever. Then again, I mean, really, who am I kidding? You rejected it as the explanation for life's history before you even knew what it was. Next, he goes on to say that though many evolutionary biologists would claim that I am off balance, it seems to me that the absence of any conceivable naturalistic explanation for the origin and natural history of life's major groups opens up the possibility for the work of the Creator. Russ, you're not necessarily off balance, imbalanced perhaps, but you simply don't know what the hell you're talking about. Most rational people will refrain from discussing things that they clearly don't understand, but for whatever reason you lack this reservation. Now, there is a conceivable naturalistic explanation for life on Earth. You simply value zealotry over reason and choose to ignore it. So here we have it again, ladies and gentlemen. Fuzz Rana lying for Jesus. On an amusing side note, I attempted to call back the radio station a couple months after our first bout and was informed that they were no longer taking live calls for some reason. I'll let you decide. Well, guys, thank you very much for your time, and hope you enjoyed the video. Take care.